The walls stood where no walls should have been. That was the first thing Rowan Falk noticed when he came over the ridge on that iron-cold morning breath clouding in the frozen air, snowshoes breaking through the crusted surface with a rhythm that had carried him 4 miles through drifts that reached his chest in places. He had come expecting to find wreckage. He had come expecting to find what winter always left behind when it was finished with the foolish and the unprepared. Instead, he found walls. They rose from the earth like something out of a dream cordwood ends jutting from gray mortar in a pattern he had never seen in all his years of frontier life, a texture that caught the thin winter light and held it. 4 walls, a roof of cedar shakes, smoke rising from a stone chimney in a thin, steady column that spoke not of desperation but of careful management of someone who understood exactly how much wood a fire needed and gave it no more. Rowan stopped walking. He stood in the snow and stared. He had told them they would die out there. He had told them plainly, the way a man tells a hard truth when he has watched enough people learn it the costly way. 2 girls, he had said. 2 girls cannot raise walls before the freeze. And he had believed every word of it. He crossed the clearing and stood before the south wall. He pulled off one heavy mitten, pressed both palms flat against the mortar surface. The wall was warm, not warm the way a stone in summer sun is warm. Warm the way a living thing is warm, steady deep. Holding heat the way the earth holds it far below the frost line. The cold outside had been brutal for 3 days. Whatever was burning in that stove, it was a fraction of what his own cabin had consumed. And yet, this wall, this impossible, ridiculous wall, built from scraps and limestone and stubbornness, was warmer than his own home had been during the worst of the storm. Rowan Falk had survived many winters on the frontier. He had buried 2 younger brothers to the cold. He had learned everything there was to know about what kept a person alive when the temperature dropped past the point where spit froze before it hit the ground. He had been wrong about all of it. His hand went to his coat pocket. His fingers found the edge of a folded envelope, the letter he had been carrying for months, the one a dying man had pressed into his hands and asked him to keep safe. He had kept it. He had told himself he was waiting for the right moment. The truth, standing here now with warm mortar under his palms, was something he could no longer avoid. He had kept it because he had not believed. But that moment, the moment of reckoning, lay months in the future, separated from this cold morning by everything that had happened in between. What came before it was a story that deserved to be told from the beginning. A story about 2 sisters, $4 and 40 acres of land that everyone agreed was worthless. A story about walls that should not have existed, built by hands that everyone agreed were not strong enough to build them. The fever took their father in late autumn, the year everything changed. He had been a strong man, once a fisherman's son from the northern coast of the old country, who had crossed an ocean with his wife and 2 daughters, and worked himself hollow in the mills and the yards of an eastern city, saving every coin living on less than less, because he believed in something on the other side of all that sacrifice. 40 acres. A deed with his name on it. Land where his family could build something that no landlord could take away. He never reached it. The fever came from the crowded boarding house where they lived, the kind of sickness that moves through close quarters, like smoke invisible until it has already taken hold. By the time his hands could no longer grip and his eyes began to glaze, it was already beyond what any doctor in that city could touch. Solveig, 19 years old, held his hand, and watched the light in him dim. She was the eldest. She was the one who had always stood between her family and the world's hard edges. She could not stand between him and this. Her mother lasted 3 weeks longer. Not because she was stronger, she was not sick, not at first, but because she had 2 daughters who still needed a mother, and she fought to stay as long as she could. When she finally let go on a gray morning that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, it was Astri's hand she held. Astri 17, small and quiet and precise in everything she did, with eyes that noticed what others missed. Their mother's last words were simple. Take care of your sister. Come what may. The banking crisis came the same week. It swept through the region like a cold wind through a cracked door, invisible, then everywhere, then impossible to ignore. The institution where their father had kept 3 years of careful savings closed its doors without warning. The family that had carried them stood in the street with 100 other families and learned that the numbers in the ledger were gone as completely as if they had never existed. What remained was this $4 in coin that Solveig had kept in the toe of her boot, out of some instinct she could not have named. A hand axe, a buck saw, a draw knife, and a deed to 40 acres of land in the northern frontier country, land their father had purchased from a railroad pamphlet land. He had never seen land that everyone in the city said was as good a foundation as a man could want for a new life. They walked 5 days through country that grew wilder and emptier with each mile, through the edges of small settlements and long stretches of cut-over land where the logging crews had passed through years before and taken everything worth taking. Solveig carried the heavier sack. Astri carried the tools. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say that the walking did not already say. When they finally stood on their 40 acres, they understood why the railroad pamphlet had not included a picture. Stumps. Hundreds of them, some as wide across as a man's arms could reach, jutting from the earth in every direction, like the remnants of a battle between giants. Brush and scrub growth tangled between them. Not a single tree standing that a sawmill would have touched. The loggers had been thorough. What they left behind was everything they had deemed worthless, crooked cedar, short poplar, knotted oak. Solveig stood among the stumps and said nothing. Astri stood beside her and said nothing. The wind moved through the brush with a sound like breathing. It was Rowan Falk who found them there, or rather, who they went to find the nearest neighbor, a farmer 4 miles west, whose name they had heard in the last settlement. A man who knew this land. A man who had survived where others had not. He was mending a harness in his dooryard when they arrived. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he already knows the end of. He listened to what they had. $4, an axe, 40 acres of stumps and crooked wood. He listened to what they needed. Shelter before the freeze, which was coming in 8 weeks, perhaps less. He looked at their hands. He looked at the sky. He set down his harness. 2 girls cannot raise walls before the freeze. His voice was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. You will die out there, and no one will find your bodies until spring. The boarding house in the nearest settlement turned them away. Every neighbor's curtain stayed drawn. The world they had walked into had already made up its mind about them. That night, huddled in a canvas tent on their own land, Solveig went through the last of their father's belongings by firelight. and at the bottom of his canvas sack, folded small and worn soft at the creases, as though it had been opened and closed many times over many years, she found a piece of paper. It was covered in her father's handwriting, small and careful, the letters of a man who had taught himself to read and write as an adult and never quite lost the formality of that effort. Some of it was in the old language. Some of it was in English, translated in the margins. There were rough sketches, a wall cross-section, a corner joint dimensions she could not yet make sense of. At the top in the old language was a single line. She could read enough to make out the meaning from grandfather's village. "Ask me when you are ready." He had never told her. He had never had the chance. The fire burned low. Astri was asleep. The wind moved through the canvas walls of the tent with a sound that was nothing like the sound of a real wall. Solveig held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She did not know what it meant yet. She did not know what her grandfather had built, or where or why, or whether any of it could be made to work in this cold and stubborn country, on this particular patch of earth, with these particular hands. What she knew was this: her father had thought it worth keeping. Her father had thought it worth carrying across years and miles and one ocean. And her father, whatever his flaws and whatever his losses, had not been a foolish man. She folded the paper and put it in her own boot next to what remained of their $4. "We find limestone," she said quietly to the dark and the wind, and no one in particular, "and we find out what grandfather knew." Tomorrow the work would begin. Burning lime was not work for the impatient. The limestone was there just as Solveig had hoped. She found it on the second morning, walking the creek line that cut along the eastern edge of their land, gray stone jutting from the embankment in long flat shelves, as though the earth had been waiting for someone to notice. She stood on the bank and looked at it for a long moment. Then she took off her boot and looked at the folded paper inside. The sketch was rough, but the logic was clear enough once she understood what she was looking at. 2 layers of mortar, one on the inside face, one on the outside. A gap between them filled with something lightweight and fibrous. Short rounds of wood set upright between the mortar beds, end grain facing out. The cross-section of a wall that looked at first glance like nothing so much as a very elaborate woodpile. That was the joke people would make about it later. She did not know that yet. What she knew, standing at the creek bank with cold water seeping through the seam of her left boot, was that this sketch described something that could actually be built from what they had. Not from the long, straight timber that every proper cabin required. From the short, crooked, knotted, worthless wood that covered every inch of their 40 acres. She looked up at the limestone shelf. She looked back at the paper. She said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to, and because some decisions settle themselves quietly, without ceremony. She rolled up her sleeves and began. It required building a kiln, a rough enclosure of stacked stone with a firing chamber below, and the limestone pieces stacked above, and then feeding a sustained fire for the better part of 2 days, hot enough and long enough to drive the carbon dioxide out of the stone and leave behind quicklime, caustic, reactive, dangerous if handled carelessly, and absolutely essential to everything that came next. Solveig built her first kiln from the flattest creek stones she could carry. It took the better part of a morning. She fired it at dusk, feeding it cedar rounds through the night while Astri slept. By dawn, the stone had changed, crumbling at the edges, pale gray-white where it had been charcoal. She slaked it carefully with water from the creek, adding slowly, watching the violent reaction as the quicklime absorbed the moisture and released heat enough to blister an unwary hand. The mortar that resulted was thick and gray and smelled of something ancient mineral and sharp like the inside of a cave. She mixed it with creek sand and the fine sawdust that accumulated wherever she cut wood. The sawdust was what made it different from any mortar Solveig had ever heard of. The sawdust was what made it work. Astrid explained it on the third morning while they were laying the first test section against a stump of practice wall 4 feet long and 2 feet high, just to see if the logic held. Solid mortar conducts cold, Astrid said, setting a cedar round into its bed and pressing it down with both hands to seat it properly. Stone conducts, brick conducts. Anything dense carries heat from the warm side to the cold side like water moving through sand. She reached for another round, checked the end grain tight rings, good cedar, and set it alongside the first. But sawdust traps air. Millions of tiny pockets that heat cannot move through easily. The 2 mortar faces are like 2 walls. The sawdust fill between them is the blanket. Solveig pressed her palm against the outer face of the test section. Even in the cold morning air, the mortar held a faint warmth from where the weak autumn sun had touched it an hour earlier. And the end grain facing out, she said. End grain sheds water. Side grain soaks it in like cloth. Astrid smoothed a joint with a small wooden trowel she had carved herself from a scrap of poplar. If we lay the rounds lengthwise, the rain will find its way in and rot them from the inside out. End grain dries fast even after a soaking. The water beads and runs off. Solveig nodded slowly. The logic was elegant, the kind of thinking that hid itself inside simplicity that looked obvious only after someone had already worked it out. She picked up her axe and went back to cutting rounds. The frame went up in the second week. 4 corner posts of the straightest cedar they could find, not truly straight, but close enough sunk deep in the frozen ground and braced with rope stays while the mortar cured around their bases. Cross beams at 5 feet and again at 8 notched into the posts with joints that Solveig cut by eye-checking and rechecking with a plumb line she had made from a stone and a length of cordage. The frame was the skeleton. Everything else would hang from it, lean against it, take its shape from it. She had to get it right because the walls that would follow could not correct a frame that was wrong. She checked each post individually, standing back and sighting along them the way a carpenter checks a door for plumb, not with any instrument more sophisticated than her own eye and the plumb line and the accumulated experience of 3 weeks of cutting and fitting and adjusting. Her eye had gotten better. She could feel it getting better each day the way a skill feels when it is being used past the point of conscious effort and beginning to settle into something more like instinct. Her father had told her once back in the city when she was very young, and he was teaching her to braid rope that your hands know things your mind hasn't worked out yet. Trust your hands. She trusted her hands. Raising the upper cross beams alone was the problem she had not fully solved when she started. A 12-foot beam of green cedar was not heavy in the way that a man could not lift it. Solveig could lift one end easily enough. The problem was the other end and the height, and the fact that there were 2 of them and only 4 hands between them. She solved it the way she solved most problems, by lying awake until the solution presented itself. A block and tackle rigged from a length of rope looped over a high branch, the mechanical advantage tripling the effective force of every pull. It took most of a day to raise the first beam, working the rope inch by inch, Astri bracing with a wooden prop while Solveig hauled. When it finally seated in its notch with a sound like a door closing firmly, Solveig sat down in the mud and pressed both hands over her eyes. Not from joy, from the knowledge that there were 3 more beams to raise and 2,000 rounds to cut, and the weather was already sharpening toward winter with an intent that could not be mistaken. And from something else, from the particular vertigo of a person who has just done something they were told was impossible, and finds that the impossibility did not disappear, but simply moved somewhere further ahead. Astri sat down beside her in the mud without being asked. They sat in silence for a moment, the two of them looking at the beam they had raised together in this field of stumps that their father had bought with his last savings. The sky above them was the pale gray of late autumn, and the trees at the edge of their land still held a few leaves orange and brown, moving in a wind that smelled of ice. He would have liked this, Astri said finally. She did not say who she meant. She did not need to. Yes, Solveig agreed. He would have asked a great many questions about the block and tackle. Astri made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. They sat for 4 minutes. Then they stood and went back to work. Wren appeared on a Tuesday, or what Solveig believed was a Tuesday. She had begun to lose track of the days which happened when the shape of a day was defined entirely by what needed to be done rather than by any external rhythm. She was carrying rounds from the drying stack when she heard something at the edge of the clearing, not footsteps, but a presence, the kind of stillness that a living creature makes when it has stopped moving and is deciding whether to trust what it sees. A dog. Thin ribs showing through a coat that had once been handsome, a shepherd mix with amber eyes, and a tail that hung low, but had not entirely given up. Solveig looked at it. The dog looked at her. Neither moved for a long moment. Astri appeared from behind the drying stack, crouched down, and held out her hand. The dog did not come immediately. It sniffed the air, looked at. Solveig looked back at Astri, and then walked forward in the careful way of a creature that has been disappointed before, and is not yet ready to be disappointed again. "We can't feed another mouth," Solveig said. "She can earn her keep," Astri said, which was not an argument so much as a statement of what would happen. She named the dog Wren for the small bird that sings loudest in winter. Wren earned her keep from the first day. She slept across the doorway at night, woke at sounds that Solveig could not hear, and positioned herself between any approaching stranger and the 2 young women she had decided belonged to her. She growled exactly once at a man who came too close without announcing himself. She never growled at the wrong person. There was something else Wren did, something Solveig noticed, but could not fully articulate until much later. On the worst mornings when the cold was deepest and the work felt most impossible, and the deadline pressed so close it was almost physical, Wren would appear at Solveig's side and simply walk with her, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, simply present, matching her pace, breathing steadily. It was not a strategy. It was company. And company, Solveig discovered, was a different kind of fuel, one that did not diminish when shared, but grew. Pastor Whitmore came in the 2nd week of October riding a mule that matched his expression. He was a man who took his responsibilities seriously. And one of those responsibilities was the spiritual health of the settlement's inhabitants. He had heard about the woodpile house. He had come to assess the situation and, if necessary, to offer counsel. He stood in front of the rising south wall and looked at it for a long time, with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "The old knowledge," he said finally. "Some in the settlement say it is pagan wisdom, mountain superstition." Solveig set down the round she was carrying. "Our grandfather was a Christian man. He attended services every week until he was too old to make the walk. He taught us the same faith he carried from the old country, along with everything else he knew." She looked at the wall. He looked at what the earth gave him, and he used it. He thanked God for what the earth gave him, and he used it. Is that different from what we are doing here? The pastor walked to the wall and looked closely at the mortar joints, the way the lime had sealed around each round the texture of the surface. Something in his expression shifted. "I will pray for you," he said at last. "I will pray that your walls hold and that your faith is rewarded. That is all we ask." He remounted his mule, but before he rode away, he turned back. "If you survive the winter, come to services in spring. I would like to hear how your prayers were answered." "If we survive the winter," Solveig said, "we will be there." The first visitor to examine the work seriously came in late September. He was lean and dark, perhaps 50, with burn scars on both forearms, visible even through his coat sleeves when he dismounted and pushed them up to examine the wall. His hands were the hands of someone who spent their life working with fire and iron, thick, calloused, permanently stained. He walked to the rising south wall without asking permission. He ran both palms along the mortar surface the way a craftsman examines a joint not to admire it, but to understand it. "Desmond Trell," he said, without looking up from the wall. "Smithy, 6 miles north." "Solveig," she said, "this is our land." I heard. He pressed his thumb into a mortar joint, testing the set. "They're calling it the woodpile house in the settlement." He stepped back and looked at the wall. He said 2 girls were stacking firewood and calling it a cabin. "That is not quite accurate," Astri said from the other end of the wall where she was laying the next course. She did not look up. "The firewood is structural." Trell made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He crouched and looked at the base of the wall, examining the footing. Then he walked the full perimeter. When he came back, his expression had shifted the look of a man who builds things for a living, encountering something he has not seen before. "The sawdust in the fill," he said. "Whose idea was that?" "Our grandfathers," Solveig said. "His grandfathers before him, perhaps." Trell was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his saddlebag and set a cloth sack on the nearest stump. "My wife used to say that the people who know the least about what's possible are usually the ones who accomplish the impossible." He mounted his horse. She was the stubborn kind. Wouldn't hear a word against something once she decided to try it. He gathered the reins. She died 2 winters past. I find I miss that quality in a person. He rode away without looking back. The sack contained 20 pounds of salt pork and a smaller bag of dried beans. There was no note. None was needed. Solveig stood holding the sack and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, not enough to call relief, but enough to remind her that the world was not made entirely of people like Crane. The rain came in mid-October, and it came for 3 days without mercy. Cold rain, the kind that was not quite sleet, but carried all of sleet's malice horizontal in the wind, finding every gap in clothing, turning the building site to a mud trap that sucked at boots, and made every step cost twice what it should. Mortar would not cure in rain. Wood would not dry. She could not work. This was the fact she kept arriving at from every direction she tried to approach the problem. She could not work, and the freeze was coming, and she had perhaps 18 days of mortar work left, and 22 days at most before the temperature dropped past the point where fresh mortar would be destroyed overnight by frost. The mathematics had never looked as bad as they did on the second morning of rain when she went to check the lime supply and found the third kiln had taken on water. The stone was wet through. The careful stack of fuel wood beside it had turned to a sodden mass. The whole thing had collapsed inward during the night, mixing wet limestone with wet ash and mud, and what remained was a heap of material that would have to be dug out, sorted, dried, and rebuilt before it could be used. 2 days of work gone. Solveig stood at the edge of the ruined kiln in the rain and felt something she had not let herself feel since she had stood outside the boarding house in the city with the dead bank's locked doors at her back. Not grief exactly. Closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a very high place and looking down. Then Astrid appeared at her elbow, picking her way carefully through the mud in boots that were already soaked through. "How much lime do we have left?" she said. "Enough for perhaps a third of what we still need." Astrid nodded slowly. Crane is waiting for this exact moment. She reached down and picked up a piece of the wet limestone weighted in her hand. "Are you going to give it to him?" The question was not rhetorical. It was not unkind. It was exactly the question that the situation called for, asked by someone who understood that sometimes a person needs to hear the choice stated plainly before they can make it properly. "Build it smaller this time," Solveig said finally. "Better covered. We fire it tonight and we don't sleep until it's done." Astrid set the limestone piece down. "Then we should start now." They rebuilt the kiln that afternoon, smaller roofed with overlapping bark slabs that shed the rain reasonably well, the firing chamber positioned to draw air from the lee side away from the wind. They fired it at dusk, sitting on opposite sides of the structure with bark hoods pulled over their heads. Wren lay between them, pressed against first one and then the other for warmth, occasionally raising her head to listen to something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. She put her head back down and sighed heavily, as though the rain were a personal inconvenience being inflicted specifically upon her. Astrid laughed at that. It was a small sound quickly swallowed by the rain, but it was real, and Solveig, hearing it, felt some of the weight in her chest shift into something more bearable. By dawn, they had lime. Not enough, not nearly enough, but some. And some was more than none, which was what the mathematics had suggested they would have. What would you have done in that moment, standing in the rain, looking at a ruined kiln, a deadline you cannot move, and a sister who refuses to let you give up? Would you have rebuilt, or would you have decided that some odds are simply too long? Bediah Crane came on the last day of October. He came with 6 men settlers and townspeople who rode out together with the easy looseness of people who expect to be entertained. Solveig heard them coming from half a mile away. She kept working. She had learned by then that the worst thing she could do with a man like Crane was to stop what she was doing. Crane was the kind of man who wore prosperity like armor. His coat was good wool, his boots were oiled, his horse was well fed. He owned the general store at the settlement center and a significant portion of the debt that the surrounding families carried, and he had the manner of a man who understood that information and leverage were more durable currencies than coin. He rode the full perimeter of the cabin's rising walls with the expression of a man at a county fair examining an unusual exhibit. The walls were 5 feet high now on 2 sides, the rounds packed tight in their mortar beds. Remarkable, he said, and let the word do the work he intended it to do. I have never seen firewood stacked with such ambition. Laughter from the men behind him. Solveig did not look up. He dismounted and walked close enough that she had to acknowledge him. Wren, who had been lying beside the mortar trough, stood up without making a sound. She simply stood watching Crane with a stillness that was somehow more unnerving than noise. I want to be direct with you, Crane said. I would be willing to take this parcel off your hands. $12. That's a fair price for raw land with no improvements. Our father paid more than that. Your father bought at the height of speculation. The land is worth what someone will pay for it, and right now, with winter coming. He gestured at the walls. With respect, this will not survive a hard freeze. The mortar will crack. The rounds will shift. The land is not for sale, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to the men behind him. You heard her. He reached into his coat and produced a small leather wallet. $20 to any man here who wants to wager that this structure is standing come the new year. 3 men took the bet. Crane mounted his horse. I'll come back in spring, he said. If you're still here, I'll be glad to say I was wrong. He rode away. Wren sat back down beside the mortar trough as calmly as though nothing had happened. Solveig picked up her round and set it in place. The legal threat arrived on a gray afternoon 2 weeks before the freeze. Crane came alone this time. He produced a folded document from inside his coat and set it on the nearest stump. There's a question about the registration of this property. Your father purchased it, but the full registration was never completed before he passed. There's a $15 filing fee required to secure the title. It has to be paid within 30 days, or the property reverts to unregistered status, at which point a competing claim can be filed. We don't have $15. No, Crane said. I suspected not. He left the document on the stump and rode away. That night, after Astrid was asleep, Solveig sat beside the small fire they had built in the shell of the cabin's interior and looked at the paper for a long time. She thought about selling. She let herself think about it honestly, the way you have to think about something when it is a real option rather than just a fear. $15 for a piece of land their father had believed in. Enough to rent a room in the settlement through the winter. Enough to buy food and stay warm. Astrid would be safe. That was what the thinking always came back to. Astrid, who was 17 and brilliant and had never once complained, not through any of it. Solveig looked at the walls. She thought about her father carrying that folded paper for years. She thought about what it meant to carry something that long past all the hard seasons past, all the moments when it would have been easier to leave it behind. She put the document in her boot alongside the sketch from her father's bag. 2 pieces of paper, different kinds of instructions. In the morning, she went to find Desmond Trell. The blacksmith listened without interruption, which was a quality Solveig had come to appreciate in a person. He read the legal document twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on his workbench. Crane's done this before, he said. A family came through 3 seasons ago, man and wife, 2 small boys, land east of yours. They left in the first hard frost, and I never heard why. $15 was what I heard mentioned. He picked up a horseshoe blank and turned it in his hands. I can cover the fee. Call it credit against the labor you'll owe me come spring. But there's a man who handles some legal work for families in the area Harlan Voss who should look at this first. If Crane has done this more than once, there may be grounds for a larger complaint." That evening, Solveig told Astrid. Astrid listened, and then she said, "He didn't have to do that." "No," Solveig agreed. "Why did he?" Solveig thought about the sack of salt pork. About the woman Trell had described, stubborn wouldn't hear a word against something once she decided to try it. About the way grief sometimes makes people want to do the thing the person they lost would have wanted them to do. "I think," she said slowly, "that kindness sometimes comes from loss, from knowing what it means to be without someone who would have helped." Astrid considered this. Then she nodded once and picked up her trowel. The north wall rose through the last weeks before the freeze with a pace that felt to Solveig like running a race against an opponent who never tired. She woke before light and worked until she could not see. The north wall was the wall she had saved for last because it needed to be strongest. It would face the killing wind when winter came, would take the brunt of every storm that drove down from the open country to the northwest, and she had wanted to be most skilled before she built it. Now she wondered if she had miscalculated if saving the hardest for last when the deadline was hardest on her heels was wisdom or hubris. The mathematics said she had perhaps 18 days. She needed 22. Leander Trell Desmond's son had begun coming out on afternoons to learn the technique. He was 30 quiet in a way that was not unfriendly, but was not performative either quiet because he was paying attention because the questions were more interesting to him than the sound of his own voice. He had his father's hands and his mother's patience, or so Desmond had once mentioned without elaborating. He carried rounds without being asked mixed mortar when the trough ran low and never once said anything about whether he thought the project would succeed. He asked good questions. Not the skeptical questions that Crane had asked those designed to expose weakness, but the genuinely curious questions of a person who is trying to understand how something works so that he can use it himself someday. Why does the lime need to slake for so long before it's ready to mix? What happens if you rush it? How do you know when the mortar has cured enough to support the next course? What's the right consistency? How does it feel when it's correct? He wrote the answers in a small notebook that he kept in his coat pocket, and Solveig could see him some evenings reading back over what he'd written by the light of the fire he'd built at the edge of the clearing. On an evening when the first hard frost was threatening, he helped Solveig raise the last crossbeam working the rope and tackle rig with a steadiness that made the difference between a beam seated cleanly and a beam that would have to be repositioned. When it dropped into its notch, he let out a long breath and looked at Solveig. "Your grandfather really built like this," he said. His grandfather did. The knowledge came to him the way these things do from someone who had already worked out what the cold required. Leander looked at the walls rising around the frame, at the shaped and rounded form of something that was not yet a cabin, but was no longer just a collection of materials. Something that had a shape now. Something that was becoming. "It's going to stand," he said, not as a compliment, as an assessment. Solveig did not answer because she was not yet willing to say it out loud. To say it felt like tempting something, but she thought it. She thought it on the walk home that evening, and she thought it in the dark before sleep, and she thought it the next morning when she rose before dawn and went back to the work. The cabin closed on a day when the mud had finally frozen hard enough to walk on without sinking, and the breath hung in the air long after a person had moved through it and the quality of the light had the low, flat quality of a season that has committed to its purpose. 4 walls. A roof of cedar shakes split and nailed over rafters that Solveig had shaped by hand. A door of cedar planks joined with wooden pegs she had no nails to spare, and hung on leather hinges cut from the strap of her pack, the leather she had kept because something in her had refused to discard it. Oiled paper in the window openings stretched taut and rubbed until it was nearly translucent. A stone chimney that had taken a week to build properly, and another 2 days of anxious watching to confirm it, drew without backdrafting smoke into the interior. She stood in the doorway on the day the last piece went in a simple wooden latch she had carved over 3 evenings, a loop of rope through a hole in the door dropping into a catch on the inside, and she looked at the interior of the cabin. At the 12 by 16 feet of space that she and Astri had built from an axe and a saw and limestone from a creek bank and wood that no logging crew had found worth taking. She looked at it and tried to feel something commensurate with what had been accomplished, and found that what she felt was mostly tired, and underneath the tired was something that would take several more days to fully arrive. Something that, when it came, she would not have a word for in English. She had a word for it in the old language. Her mother had used it sometimes on certain evenings when everything had somehow gone right. A word that meant something like this is what it was for. The stove was the final problem. A cabin without a stove was not a shelter. It was a box. The cheapest stove in Crane's general store was priced beyond anything Solveig had available. The solution arrived in the form of a departing family settlers who had tried the frontier and found it beyond what they were willing to endure, selling everything they could not carry. Among their goods, a small box stove rusted at the joints, cracked along one seam, priced at $3. She had 73 cents. She was standing in front of the stove calculating whether any combination of words or labor could close the gap when Desmond Trell appeared in the doorway. He looked at the stove. He looked at Solveig. He looked at the settler. "I'll take the difference in labor," Trell said. 3 days of this woman's work come spring. I'll guarantee it. Solveig carried the stove 3 miles home that afternoon, the cast iron digging into her shoulders with every step, Wren walking beside her with the attentive patience of someone accompanying a person through a difficult task. From somewhere behind her she heard Crane's voice at a volume designed to be heard. "That stove won't save them. The whole thing will be kindling by January." She walked. The stove was heavy. The road was long. She walked. On a late afternoon in the deep of autumn, Solveig lit the stove for the first time. The chimney drew. The cedar rounds in the firebox caught and held. The warmth began slowly at first, then steadily, then with the particular settled quality that she had been imagining for months and had not quite let herself believe in until this exact moment. The thermometer that Leander had brought as an unannounced gift, left on the stump outside the door one morning with no note attached, read 44 degrees inside the cabin. Outside, the first true freeze had dropped the temperature to 22. 22 degrees of difference, held by 16 inches of cordwood and mortar and sawdust insulation, and 2 young women who had been told they would not survive. Astri sat on the packed earth floor near the stove, her back against the south wall, Wren's head in her lap. She was not crying. She simply sat there with her eyes closed and her head tipped back against the warm mortar in the particular stillness of someone who has carried a weight for a very long time and has only just this moment been allowed to set it down. The walls held the heat quietly, the way they had been designed to do. Outside, Winter was sharpening itself against the sky, but inside it was 44 degrees and the fire was burning steady and the walls were warm to the touch. For the first time since they had arrived on this land, Solveig believed they would survive to see the spring. What would you have done standing in that doorway, looking at those walls? Would you have had the courage to keep building when everything and everyone said stop? The answer she was beginning to understand mattered less than the building. Some questions are not meant to be answered in advance. They are meant to be lived. The warmth held through the first month of winter. That was the thing that surprised Solveig most. Not that the walls worked because she had built them to work, had calculated and recalculated the mortar ratios and the round diameters, and the sawdust fill until the numbers satisfied her. What surprised her was the quality of the warmth. Not the desperate, fuel-hungry heat of a stove burning too hard against a losing battle. Something steadier than that. Something that felt in the deep of a cold night, almost like the earth itself was holding them. She would wake at 3 a.m. and lie still in the darkness, listening. Outside, the wind moved through the stumps and the scrub growth with sounds that changed as the cold deepened first. A rushing, then a hiss, then something lower and more fundamental that had no comfortable name. And inside silence, warmth, the faint smell of cedar and lime and wood smoke that had become without her noticing the smell of home. The stove needed tending twice a day, not every 2 hours, not every 90 minutes. The way other cabins required through the worst cold, twice a day morning and evening with enough fuel to last the interval comfortably. The 16 inches of cordwood wall were doing the work that in other cabins was left entirely to the fire, absorbing heat slowly during the warm hours, and releasing it slowly through the cold ones, smoothing out the temperature swings that wore down both wood supply and the people tending it. Solveig kept a record on a piece of bark with a charcoal stick. Inside temperature twice daily. Outside temperature estimated by the behavior of the water in the bucket, kept just outside the door, at what point it skimmed, at what point it froze solid. It was an imprecise instrument, but it told her what she needed to know. The difference between inside and outside was holding at 20 degrees in the coldest nights. Then 22. One morning she checked and found 25 degrees of difference the stove barely fed, and she stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the walls around her with an expression that a person who had known her well might have recognized as the closest thing to wonder that Solveig's face had ever produced. She let herself feel this for exactly one evening. Then she went back to cutting firewood because the walls could only do so much, and what they could not do was generate heat from nothing. She still needed 6 cords to be safe through winter. She had 3.5. Every morning she went out with the axe and came back with more. And every evening she stacked it against the north wall under a bark roof she had built for exactly this purpose. And every night she counted the cords and calculated and planned. Astrid had begun teaching herself something new that winter, not the practical things she had always known those. What she was teaching herself now was something older, the skill of looking at a thing and understanding not just what it was, but what it had been and what it was in the process of becoming. She began with the wood. With the round she cut and stacked and sorted. She noticed patterns in the end grain, the spacing of the rings, the color variations that indicated wet years and dry years. The way certain trees had responded to damage or drought decades before they were cut. She kept notes on bark scraps. She developed a shorthand symbols for growth rate symbols, for moisture content symbols, for the particular qualities that made one piece of cedar better suited for a corner round and another better suited for the middle courses. Then she started on the stone. She began cataloging the limestone by location and depth and color, trying to understand what variables produced what outcomes in the mortar. Solveig watched this process with a feeling she could not quite name, something between admiration and the quiet recognition that her sister's mind worked on a different scale than her own. Solveig thought in terms of problems and solutions. Astrid thought in terms of systems, of the relationships between things, of what the evidence said about what was not yet visible. In another life, in the life their father had been trying to build for them, with schools and books and the kind of future that required stability to reach, Astrid would have been the sort of person that institutions recognized and rewarded. Here in a 12 by 16-foot cabin on 40 acres of stumps, she was becoming something rarer, a person who taught herself. The trouble with Astrid's arm began on a morning that had no particular warning. The temperature had dropped overnight past the point where the creek made sounds under its ice. Solveig woke before light and dressed in the dark, careful not to disturb Astrid, who had been sleeping badly for the past several nights, not from illness, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that would not stop working, even when the body needed it to. She was carrying the third armload of wood back toward the door when she heard a sound behind her, a sharp crack, then a sliding, then a thud that landed wrong. Not the sound of wood falling, something heavier than wood. She dropped the armload and turned. Astrid had come out behind her. She had stepped onto the flat stone they used as a threshold step, and the stone had been glazed overnight with a film of ice so thin it was invisible, the particular treachery of a temperature drop on a surface that had been slightly damp from the previous day's melt. She was on the ground. Her right arm was twisted under her at an angle that made Solveig's vision sharpen in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The damage was bad, but not the worst it could have been. The gash ran from the inside of Astrid's elbow to a point midway down her forearm. The bone was intact. The tendons moved. But the depth was serious, and what came after bleeding infection with no physician available in a winter with no way to travel for help was what Solveig did not say aloud. She bound the wound and elevated the arm and made Astrid drink water, which Astrid accepted without argument, which told Solveig more than anything else had about how much pain her sister was in. Wren came from the corner where she slept without being summoned. She lay down against Astrid's side and pressed there steady and warm. Astrid's free hand found the dog's back without looking. "The north wall," Astrid said finally, when the immediate work was done. "I'll watch it. The mortar batch from the second week of laying, it's the one I'm most concerned about. Third course up from the sill on the eastern end." "I know which one." Astrid closed her eyes. "Good." That night, with Astrid asleep and the fire banked, Solveig sat alone in the dark of the cabin and allowed herself for the first time to not know what came next. It was a brief concession. She could not afford to extend it, but she gave herself that much the honest acknowledgement that she was afraid that the situation had moved past the kinds of danger she had prepared for, and into a kind of danger that preparation could not fully address. She looked at the walls. The mortar glowed faintly warm in the stove's low light, the round ends of the cedar logs casting small shadows, the whole surface textured and solid and quietly, stubbornly present. She reached into her boot and took out the folded paper. She had read it many times by now, enough times that she knew the sketch by heart. But there was something at the bottom of the page, a final passage in her father's handwriting, in the old language which she had been able to partially parse, but had never fully translated because the vocabulary was from a form of the language older than what she had grown up speaking. The fire was low. She stirred it up. In the stronger light, she worked through the passage word by word, constructing meaning the way you build a wall, one piece at a time, each one depending on what came before. It took her nearly an hour. When she had it, she sat for a long time without moving. Her grandfather had not invented the technique out of ingenuity alone. He had used it in a winter when his village had run out of every other option. A sickness had come the autumn before, and the men who would normally have felled and hauled and raised the timber for new construction were not there to do it. What remained was women and children and old men and wood that any logging operation would have left behind. He had built walls from what was there. He had kept the village alive through a winter that the surrounding settlements had not fully survived. And he had written it down not in a formal record, but in a letter to his son, which his son had carried, which had eventually become the paper in the boot of a 19-year-old girl sitting alone in a cabin in the frontier dark. At the very end, in handwriting that was her grandfather's rather than her father's older, less formal, the letters formed by a hand that had learned to write, without a schoolmaster, a single line. Her father had translated it in the margin. The earth gives you everything you need. You only have to be willing to look. Solveig read it once, then again. Then she folded the paper and put it back in her boot. She did not cry. What arrived instead was something quieter, something that felt less like grief and more like being handed a tool she had not known she was missing. Her grandfather had stood where she was standing, not in this place, not with these walls, not in this particular darkness, but in the same essential situation. Without enough, without help, without any guarantee that what he was attempting would work. And he had looked at what the earth had given him, and he had used it. She looked at the walls again. Then she lay down beside her sleeping sister and slept until morning. The signs began 3 days later. Wren noticed first. The dog had been restless the previous evening, pacing the perimeter of the cabin interior with the low contained energy of something that cannot name what it is responding to, but cannot ignore it either. She would not settle. She ate half her food and left the rest, which she never did. She pressed against the door twice, not scratching to go out, but simply pressing as if trying to take a reading from what was on the other side. In the morning, the sky was wrong. Wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, not dramatically wrong, not the obvious wrongness of visible storm clouds. Wrong in a subtler way, a quality of the light that was off by some small but significant degree yellow, where it should have been white. And the temperature was wrong. It was warmer than it should have been, noticeably, inexplicably, suspiciously mild. Astrid looked at the sky from the cabin doorway for a long moment. "Grandfather wrote about this," she said. Her sister had told her what the passage contained. The knowledge had passed between them like everything else, quietly, without ceremony. About what? About the false warmth, the way the air rises before a great cold, the way the temperature climbs for a day or half a day, as if trying to give you false confidence, and then drops so fast that what was mud in the morning is frozen stone by afternoon. They looked at each other. "I need to warn people," Solveig said. She went first to the doctor, the person whose word carried weight in practical matters, and what she needed was someone whose agreement would convince others. He listened with the particular attention of someone who is already composing their response while the other person is still speaking. Animals don't predict weather, the doctor said, not unkindly, with the patient firmness of someone explaining something to a person who lacks the relevant education to understand it. Solveig looked at him. She thought about the paper in her boot. She thought about what it meant to know something because a careful person had written it down across generations versus what it meant to know something because an institution had certified your knowledge. She did not say any of this. She thanked him and went to the next house. Pastor Whitmore listened longer. He stood in his doorway and looked at the sky while Solveig spoke, and she could see him genuinely weighing what she was saying. Then he looked at the small cluster of men who had gathered in the road behind her, drawn by the spectacle of the girl from the woodpile house going house to house with some kind of warning, and she watched something shift in his expression. Not dismissal. More like the particular difficulty of a man who believes something privately, but cannot quite bring himself to say it publicly. "I'll pray on it," he said, which was not agreement. From the back of the gathered men, a younger voice, the woodpile girl, is scared of sunshine. Laughter. Not cruel laughter, the easy laughter of people who are warm and comfortable and have not yet received information that would make the joke feel different. Solveig looked at the sky one more time, at the yellow quality of the light, at Wren sitting at the edge of the road, watching the crowd with the particular patience of someone waiting for the situation to prove itself. She went home. She spent the remainder of the day bringing wood inside. Every piece she could carry, every load the cabin interior could hold. Astri, whose arm was healing but not healed, directed operations from a seated position, calculating load capacity and access paths. By the time the light began to fade, they had moved enough wood inside to last 4 days of hard burning, perhaps 5 if she was careful. Wren refused her evening food entirely. She paced, she pressed against the door. Then she stopped pacing and lay down in the center of the floor, facing the door, and was very, very still. "Now," Solveig said. She banked the fire to its highest sustainable output. She checked every joint around the door frame and the window openings. She checked the chimney draw. She brought the water bucket inside. She looked around the small interior of the cabin, the warm walls, the stacked wood, the oiled paper windows, the stove ticking steadily, and she thought, this is what we built. This is what it was for. Outside, something changed. Not suddenly, the stories always describe great storms as arriving all at once, a wall of white and sound appearing from nowhere. What Solveig experienced was more gradual and more absolute, a darkening at the edge of the sky that was not the darkening of evening. A pressure change that she felt first in her ears, then in the air against her skin, the particular sensation of the world pulling tight around itself. The temperature, which had been falsely mild all day, dropping not gradually but in steps, each one a significant increment, each one colder than the last, with no pause between them. The wind began as a sound before it arrived as a physical force. A long, low note, almost musical, coming from everywhere at once and from no direction in particular. Then the direction clarified from the northwest, driving hard and getting harder, and the sound stopped being musical and became something else entirely. Something that did not have a comfortable name. Something that made the walls of the cabin vibrate at a frequency that was not quite audible, but could be felt in the chest, in the sternum, in the bones. She checked the stove one more time. She checked the door latch, the rope system she had devised, simple but reliable, a loop that could be pulled from either side, and dropped into a wooden catch she had carved herself. She looked at the window coverings, the oiled paper frames. She pressed her palm to the north wall, the wall she had been most worried about, the wall Astri had cautioned her to watch. The mortar was warm. The third course up from the sill on the eastern end, the one that had concerned Astri most. She pressed both hands against it and held them there, feeling the heat stored in the wood and the lime and the sawdust, 16 inches of materials that had absorbed the day's warmth, and were holding it steady and patient against whatever came next. The door held. The walls held. The stove burned steady. And in the darkness and the cold and the building roar of something that wanted to unmake everything it touched, Solveig sat beside her injured sister and her faithful dog and her carefully stacked cord of wood, and she understood something she had been moving toward for months without quite reaching it. She had built this not for herself. She had built it because she had made a promise in a canvas tent to a piece of paper to the memory of a man who had carried knowledge across an ocean for exactly this kind of night. The building had not been about proving Crane wrong, or Rowan Falk wrong, or the boarding house, or the settlement, or anyone else who had decided in advance what two girls could and could not do. The building had been about the promise, about being the person her father had believed she could be, in the place her father had believed in enough to spend his last savings on. She did not have to wait long. The knock came near midnight. Solveig opened the door into the full force of it. The man on the threshold was not who she expected. Not Crane, not Rowan Falk, not the doctor or the pastor or any of the faces she had catalogued in the road that afternoon. It was a man she knew only by sight, Stellan, who lived alone in a small cabin to the east, who nodded when he passed in the settlement, but had never spoken more than 3 words together, who had, as far as she knew, paid no attention to the woodpile house, one way or the other. He had been walking for a long time. She could see it in the ice that had formed on every exposed surface of his clothing, in the particular quality of his movement, not the stumbling of panic, but the heavy deliberateness of someone operating on reserves that were almost gone, who was still moving, because stopping was not yet an option, but who could feel the moment approaching when it would become one. She grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. The warmth hit him like a wall. He swayed. She got him to the floor near the stove and began the work of warming him carefully, not too fast, the way her grandfather's notes had described, and the way she had thought about without expecting to use. He was conscious. He looked at her with eyes that were working, but slowly. "I almost made it," he said. His voice was not distressed. It was almost conversational, as though he were reporting on a race he had nearly won. "You did make it," Solveig said. "You're here." She stayed beside him. She kept her hands working, watching his color, watching his breathing, watching the subtle signs that told her whether what she was doing was working, or whether it was not going to be enough. It was not enough. Not because she did anything wrong, not because she stopped working or gave up or made a mistake, but because Stellan had been outside in a cold that did not negotiate for longer than anyone could have been outside in it and survived. And by the time his fist had connected with her door, he was already past the margin that warmth and care could reliably recover. He lost consciousness 40 minutes after she pulled him inside. His breathing changed in the way that breathing changes when it is starting to complete rather than continue. Solveig kept her hands on him and kept working until the work was no longer something that would help, and then she stayed beside him, because leaving seemed wrong, because no one should make that final passage alone in a stranger's cabin in a storm with no one present who knew them. He died an hour before the second knock came. She covered him with the blanket. She stood. She looked at the walls of the cabin, the warm, solid cordwood walls that had done exactly what she built them to do, that had been warm enough and safe enough to let a man die in them instead of in the snow. There was no satisfaction in that. She had not expected there to be. The second knock was Rowan Falk. He stood in the doorway with ice in his beard and a look on his face that she had never seen there before. Not fear exactly, but something more like the expression of someone who has just discovered that the floor they were standing on was not as solid as they had been standing on. He looked at her. He looked past her at the interior of the cabin, the stacked wood, the burning stove, the thermometer on the wall that read 44 degrees. He looked at the blanket-covered shape on the floor. He did not ask. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Behind him, out of the dark and the cold, came others. A family whose roof had failed children, first the smallest, nearly insensible skin, pale as winter sky. Then the doctor who came alone and would not meet her eyes when he stepped across the threshold. Pastor Whitmore, whose church had lost 2 windows. Then others, some she knew, and some she did not, until the small cabin held 17 people, and the heat from 17 bodies added itself to the heat from the stove and the stored heat of the walls. And last alone, without the documents and the witnesses and the comfortable certainty that had always accompanied him, Obadiah Crane. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. There was nothing left of the performance that usually accompanied him. Just a man who was very cold and had come to the only place that was warm. Solveig looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. It was Rowan Falk sitting against the south wall with his hands wrapped around a cup of warm water, who reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced an envelope that Solveig recognized not because she had seen it before, but because the handwriting on the outside was her father's. "I have been carrying this since before you arrived," Rowan said. His voice was quiet enough that only Solveig, crouching beside him, could hear it above the storm's sustained roar. "Your father gave it to me. He found me in the settlement the autumn he bought the land before the fever took him. He said he was not certain he would be strong enough to come out himself, and he needed someone who knew the territory to watch for his daughters." He held out the envelope. His hand was not quite steady. "I kept it," he said, "because I did not believe you could do what you were trying to do. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth was simpler than that." He looked at the walls, at the warm, mortar-smooth cordwood walls that held the heat of a stove that would have been insufficient in any other structure. "I was wrong. About the walls. About you. About what your father knew about his daughters." Solveig took the envelope. Inside, in her father's careful handwriting, was a letter to Rowan Falk that she would read properly later when there was time and light and the storm had finished with the world outside. But at the bottom of the letter, in a postscript written in a different hand, older, less formal, the letters of a man who had built walls from nothing in a winter that wanted to take everything, was a line she already knew. "The earth gives you everything you need. You only have to be willing to look." Her grandfather had written it. Her father had carried it. It had crossed an ocean in a coat pocket and then crossed a frontier in a canvas sack, and now it sat in her hands in a cabin that should not have existed, full of people who would not have survived the night without it. Outside, the storm pressed against every surface it could find. Inside, 17 people breathed the same warm air, and the stove burned steady, and the mortar held what it was built to hold. 17 people in a cabin built for two. Solveig organized them without being asked because someone had to, and because this was her space, and she understood it better than anyone else present. Families with small children nearest the stove where the warmth was most concentrated. The elderly against the south wall, which held the most stored heat. The able-bodied adults, wherever they could fit against the walls on the floor, folded into corners with the pragmatic flexibility of people who had stopped caring about comfort and started caring about survival. The doctor became useful the moment he crossed the threshold. He moved through the crowded space with the focused efficiency of someone whose training had finally found its proper application, checking hands and feet for frostbite, assessing the smallest children, requesting warm water and clean cloth. Solveig gave him what he asked for without comment. Rowan Falk sat against the south wall with his hands still wrapped around the cup she had given him. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 46 degrees, now the collective warmth of 17 bodies having added itself to the stove and the stored heat of the cordwood walls. He looked at it for a long time. "How much wood?" he said. 4 days at this consumption rate, perhaps 5 if the storm moderates. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything about what he had said in his dooryard in the autumn. He did not need to. The cabin set it for him in every warm surface and every sealed joint and every degree of temperature that separated the inside from the outside. Obadiah Crane sat in the corner furthest from the stove, which was also the coldest corner which he had arrived at by entering last and finding no other space available. He had said nothing since Solveig let him in. He sat with his coat still on knees, drawn up looking at the floor. Solveig left him there. There was too much to do. Clara had not spoken since she arrived. She was 7 years old, the daughter of a family from the nearest cluster of homesteads to the east, a family that had been among those who closed their curtains when Solveig and Astrid first arrived. The father, a broad-shouldered man named Peterson, had arrived carrying Clara over one arm and his wife's hand gripped in the other, the three of them moving with the particular desperation of people who have just watched the roof of their home do something a roof should not do. The child had been conscious throughout, eyes open, taking in the crowded lamplit interior of the cabin with a quality of attention that was not absence, but something more like excess, as though she had received more information than could currently be processed, and had defaulted to simply receiving without yet being able to respond. She did not cry. She did not ask for her mother, who was 3 feet away. She did not speak. Solveig looked at the child and recognized something in the quality of that stillness. Not damage, not absence. The particular internal retreat of someone who has witnessed something that the mind needs time to incorporate before it can return to ordinary operation. She had seen it in Astrid in the days after their mother died. There was nothing to do but wait and provide warmth, and not add pressure to a situation that already had enough. It was Wren who moved first. The dog had spent the first hours pressed against the wall near Astri's sleeping position, monitoring the crowded room with the alert patience of someone responsible for security in a situation that had become considerably more complicated than usual. She had accepted the presence of 17 strangers in her space with a dignity that struck Solveig in a moment when she had space to notice it as one of the more remarkable things she had witnessed. Sometime in the deep of the first night, when the storm was at its most sustained and the cabin had settled into the particular intimacy of people sleeping in shared necessity, Wren stood up. She moved through the sleeping bodies with the careful, precise footfall of a creature that knows exactly where its feet are at every moment. Past the doctor who was awake and keeping watch. Past Rowan Falk asleep against the south wall with his face in sleep, showing something that the waking version carefully withheld. Past Crane, who was also awake, also looking at the floor. She went to Clara. The child was not sleeping either. She was lying on her side near the stove, wrapped in the blanket, eyes open in the low light, looking at something that was not in the room. Wren approached without hurry. She simply arrived at Clara's side and lay down, pressing her full warm length against the child's back, and stayed. Clara did not move for a long moment. Then slowly, with the carefulness of someone performing an action whose outcome they are not certain of, she reached back and placed her hand on Wren's side. The dog's breathing was slow, and even a rhythm that had nothing in it of urgency or alarm that communicated without language that the present moment was survivable. The child's hand moved slightly, feeling the warmth, feeling the steadiness of breath. "Can I keep petting the dog?" The voice was small and hoarse from silence barely audible above the storm. But in the particular hush of the sleeping cabin it carried, and several people who had been pretending to sleep stopped pretending. And the doctor looked up from his post by the window, and Peterson, the father, opened his eyes and looked at his daughter with an expression that moved through his whole face in a way that had nothing to do with composure or dignity or any of the things that adults generally try to maintain in the presence of others. "Yes," Solveig said from where she was sitting beside the stove. She kept her voice even. "As long as you like." Clara petted the dog. Wren breathed. The storm pressed against the walls, and the walls held it. And in the small, warm space inside those walls, something that had been frozen in a 7-year-old child began very slowly to release. The father made a sound he tried to suppress and did not fully succeed. He was not the only one. In the low light and the crowded stillness of the storm-bound cabin, several people found that their eyes were doing things they had not instructed them to do. And no one said anything about it, because some moments require silence the way walls require mortar to hold the shape of what they contain. Astri woke in the deep of the second night. Her arm woke her, not the sharp pain of the injury itself, which had settled into a steady background ache, but the specific discomfort of a limb that had been still too long. She lay in the dark and listened to the breathing of 15 people, and the voice of the storm and the steady tick of the stove, and she looked at the ceiling of the cabin she and her sister had built. She sat up carefully so as not to wake the woman sleeping next to her. Astri found her sack by feel. She found the pieces of bark she had been using for notes. She found the charcoal stick. She began to write numbers and ratios and symbols she had developed over months of observation. The mortar formula, written out fully for the first time, not just the proportions, but the variables, the ways that different limestone produced different results, the adjustment factors for temperature, during curing the significance of sawdust particle size in the insulating fill, the frame dimensions, the spacing of the corner posts, the depth of their footings, the chimney draw ratio. She wrote down everything she knew in the most precise language available to her on pieces of bark by the light that leaked around the stove door. She wrote because she understood something that had clarified itself fully during the hours of the storm, that what she and Solveig had built was not just a shelter. It was a proof, a demonstration that the world contained possibilities that the accepted ways of doing things had not yet discovered, and a proof that no one writes down is only as durable as the people who carry it. Their grandfather had written it down. Their father had carried it. And now it was here, expressed in walls and degrees of temperature, and the breathing of 17 people who would not have survived the night in any other structure in a day's walking distance. Someone should write it down properly. Solveig found her still writing an hour later when she came to check the stove. She crouched beside her sister and looked at the bark pieces, at the careful, dense notation covering every available surface. She put her hand on Astri's shoulder for a moment. The earth gives you everything you need. She looked at her sister's face, the concentration there, and beneath the concentration, something else, the particular quality of a person doing exactly the thing they are meant to be doing. Then she went to tend the stove. By the second day, the social geometry of the cabin had reorganized itself in ways that no one had planned. Rowan Falk, who had arrived as the first and most pointed emblem of the community's rejection of everything Solveig had attempted, was now the person most actively managing the practical logistics of 17 people sharing a small space. He had the experience and the authority and the genuine usefulness that comes from having kept a family alive through many hard winters. And he deployed all of it without being asked, in the way of a man who has realized that the most available form of apology is competence in the service of the person wronged. He rationed the food with a precision that left everyone slightly unsatisfied and no one in genuine danger. He organized the rotation of sleeping and waking shifts so that the space near the stove could be shared more equitably. He managed the wood, making the calculations that Solveig had been making and arriving at the same numbers, and he told her so plainly, without making it more than it was. "You've been managing this from the beginning," he said on the afternoon of the second day. He said it quietly in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering a compliment. Someone had to. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. "My brothers died in a winter worse than this one. In a cabin I built myself with good timber and 20 men to raise it, following every method I had learned from people who knew what they were doing." He looked at the walls. The chinking cracked. The cold came through. "We ran out of wood on the third day of the worst of it." A pause. "I survived because I was the one who went out to find more. They were not." Solveig said nothing. Some things did not need a response. "What you built here," Rowan said, "is not what I would have built. It is not what anyone I know would have built. And it is warmer than anything I have ever been inside of in weather that I have only seen once before in my life." He looked at her directly. "Your grandfather knew something. You trusted that knowledge when no one else would have. And 17 people are alive today because of it." "My father trusted it first," Solveig said. Rowan nodded. His hand went briefly to his coat pocket, to the place where the envelope had been. "He did. And he trusted me to watch over it, and over you, when he could not." He looked at the floor. I am sorry I made you prove it the hard way. He said it quietly and without drama. Solveig looked at him, at the man who had months ago told her she would die out there, and that no one would find her body until spring. She looked at the lines in his face, and the gray in his beard, and the hands that had built things for 30 years, and had just spent 2 days managing the survival of 17 people in a space he had dismissed as a woodpile. You came when I called, she said finally. You did not believe me, but you came. Some people did not come. They both looked toward Crane, still in his corner, still quiet. He had eaten when food was passed to him. He had moved once to help carry water when Solveig asked directly. Otherwise, he had maintained the stillness of someone working through something privately that might take longer than a storm to resolve. Solveig looked away. There would be time for that conversation. This was not its moment. That same night, Leander, who had come to the cabin when the storm began, finding no other shelter nearer than his father's forge, sat beside Solveig after most of the others had settled into sleep. He did not say anything for a long time. The stove ticked. Wren had returned to Clara's side, where the child slept now for the first time in 2 days, one hand still resting on the dog's back. Then Leander reached over and placed his hand over Solveig's. Just that. No words. His hands were warm from the fire and hers were cold from the hours of work, and she turned her palm up and held on. Some things she was beginning to understand did not require words any more than walls required speech. They only required 2 people and warmth and the willingness to stay. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm began to release its hold. Not all at once. The wind first losing the particular sustained intensity that had made it sound like intention rather than weather dropping from its sustained roar to something more intermittent. Then the quality of the sound against the walls changed, the driven snow beginning to fall at angles that suggested a sky negotiating with gravity again. Wren raised her head. She lifted her nose and held it elevated, reading something in the air. Her tail moved. Once, then again. Clara, whose hand was resting on the dog's back, felt the movement. She looked at the window, the oiled paper window that had held through the entire storm without a single failure. The light coming through was different, still gray, but with more depth in it, something that suggested that beyond the clouds, the sun was still there, still committed to the business of sending light toward the earth. The fever broke before the storm did. Astri's voice from across the room. She had been watching her sister's face, which was something she was very good at. Solveig pressed her palm to Astri's forehead. Cool. The skin no longer hot and tight, no longer doing the work of fighting something. The color in her face had shifted from the hectic brightness of fever to something more muted and more real. The relief that moved through Solveig in that moment was physical, a loosening of something she had been holding at sustained tension for so long that she had forgotten it was tension. It released all at once, and she sat down heavily on the floor beside her sister and pressed both hands over her eyes. Astri put her good hand on her sister's arm. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture did not say more clearly. 17 people. 1 cord of wood, because the walls held. On the morning of the 4th day, Solveig opened the door. The world outside was white and silent, and completely, absolutely still, the stillness that follows great force, the particular quiet of a landscape that has been worked over by something vast and has arrived at a new configuration. Snow had piled against the north wall to a height she had to estimate because the top of the drift was above her sightline. The stumps that dotted the clearing had vanished entirely. Wren pushed past her and bounded into the snow, disappearing up to her chest with each leap, moving through the clearing with the bounding joy of a creature that has been indoors for 3 days and has strong feelings about it. She reached the center of the clearing and stopped and stood in the snow looking back at the cabin, and her tail moved with a deliberateness that communicated something Solveig could not quite name but recognized. Something like this is good. This is what was worth protecting. The south wall, which the sun reached, was as she had built it, mortar and tacked rounds, solid, not a gap in any joint she could see. The north wall, which had taken the storm's full force, showed a drift of snow packed against it to the height of the eaves. But where the wall emerged above the drift line, it was unchanged. The mortar had not cracked. The rounds had not shifted. Clara appeared at her elbow. Wren having returned to stand at the child's side with the faithfulness of something that has decided where it belongs. The child looked at the white world. She looked at the walls of the cabin. She looked at Solveig. "It didn't fall down," Clara said. "No," Solveig said. It did not. Clara considered this with the seriousness that children bring to conclusions they are still working out. Then she looked at the dog. "She knew," Clara said. "She knew it would be all right." Solveig looked at Wren, at the dog who had walked through a room full of sleeping strangers to lie beside a silent child, who had held her warmth against a small body, until the small body remembered how to speak. "Yes," Solveig said. "I think she did." The world the storm left behind was not the world that had existed before it. The landscape had been rearranged completely without apology, without any particular interest in what had been there before. Drifts stood where open ground had been. Familiar shapes had been buried or scoured clean. The settlement looked as though someone had picked it up and set it down slightly wrong, everything in approximately the right place, but nothing quite matching the memory of it. Stellan was buried when the ground softened enough to receive him. Pastor Whitmore conducted the service himself, and he said something that surprised Solveig, who stood at the back of the small gathering because she had held the man's hand through his last hour and felt she owed him her presence. Whitmore said that Stellan had died in warmth, that a woman had opened her door in the worst of the storm, and had not let go until there was nothing left to hold, that this was not nothing, that this was in fact the thing all his words had always been trying to say, expressed not in language, but in action by someone who had been given every reason to close her door and had opened it anyway. He did not look at Solveig when he said this. He did not need to. She did not feel vindicated. She felt the weight of the unnecessary loss the way she suspected she would always feel it. Not guilt, because she had done everything available to her, but grief. The grief of a warning that was real and was not believed in time. Some things are not meant to be resolved, only carried. Rowan Falk came first, which was appropriate since he had been first to condemn and first to arrive at her door. He came on a clear morning, walking across the cleared path with the deliberate stride of a man who has decided something and is following through before the decision can reconsider itself. He knocked, which he had not done in the autumn. She noticed this. He pressed both palms against the south wall the way he had done on that first morning after the storm. Then he turned and looked at her with nothing performative in his expression. "My sons need land," he said. "The good timber is gone in every direction worth going. Teach them what you know. Whatever you will accept in exchange, name it. Send them in spring, she said. We will teach them everything. Something crossed his face, not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly, but something in the territory between them. The look of a man setting down a weight and finding that the ground holds. The walls, he said, they held better than anything I have built in 30 years of building. Yes, Solveig said. He nodded and left. It was enough. The doctor came the following afternoon with his medical bag, which he set down and did not open. He examined Astri's arm honestly and told her the wound was healing well and the function would be complete. Then he stood in the doorway and looked at Astri's bark pieces, the dense notation covering every surface. I would like to read it, he said. When it is finished, I told families there was no cause for concern that afternoon. He paused. I would like to understand more precisely what I missed and why. Come back in a month, Astri said. He did. Pastor Whitmore came on a Sunday on foot. He stood in the doorway and said what needed to be said in plain language without the rhetorical architecture he usually deployed. My certainty was the danger, he said, not your walls. I will say so from the pulpit. Come back in spring, Solveig said. A word from you about the method would help families who might otherwise wait to see if it is real before trusting it. He came back in spring. He brought 3 families with him. Obadiah Crane came last. He stood outside without knocking, and she saw him from the window and went to the door. The performance had gone out of him. What remained was a man in a good coat, standing in thinning snow, with nothing left to position. He did not apologize. You lasted longer than I thought you would, he said. Solveig looked at him, at the man who had tried to take her land with a document and a deadline, who had bet publicly against her survival, who had sat in the corner of her cabin for 3 days and eaten what was offered and said nothing. The land is not for sale, she said. It never will be. He looked at the walls. His jaw worked slightly. No, he said finally. I don't suppose it would be. He turned and walked back across the snow, and the sound of his footsteps diminished, and then there was only the ordinary quiet of the winter morning. She did not feel the satisfaction she had once imagined. She felt the full weight of all of it, instead the months, the loss, the cold Stellan Astri's arm, 17 people, and 1 cord of wood. She felt it the way you feel something heavy when you pick it up to understand how heavy it actually is. Then she went inside and made 2 cups of tea and handed one to her sister. What Harlan Voss uncovered took the better part of the following season to resolve. 4 families, not 2, had lost land to Crane's method, the filing fee, the deadline, the offer to purchase, just below what the desperation of the moment made it impossible to refuse. Rowan Falk testified before the county. Desmond Trell provided records. At the end of the proceedings, Crane's trading license was suspended, and 2 of the 4 families received settlements that were less than what they had lost, and more than nothing, which was the mathematics of frontier justice in a place where institutions were still finding their shape. Solveig's title was registered uncontested clear. She repaid the filing fee to Desmond over a spring and summer of labor at his forge, and learned in the process more about the properties of metal than she had expected to find useful, and which turned out to be unexpectedly relevant to questions about heat and conductivity that Astri had been investigating in her notes. The knowledge moved sideways into unexpected places. It always did. By the time wildflowers appeared on the south-facing slopes, Rowan Falk's sons were laying their first cordwood wall. Solveig showed them everything: how to select wood, debark it, stack it for drying, how to build and fire a kiln slake lime, safely mix mortar to the right consistency by touch and smell. The two-bead technique, the sawdust, fill the end grain orientation, the plumb line, the block, and tackle for heavy framework. She answered questions until her voice went rough, and then she answered more. Leander worked alongside her on most days. One evening when the brothers had gone and the light was going golden across the clearing, he stood beside her, looking at the day's progress. A wall 3 feet high and solid and true. The end grain of the cedar rounds bright in the last of the sun. "I have been thinking about the spring," he said, "about what it might look like for a person who intended to stay in this territory for a long time. For a person who had a reason to stay." Solveig looked at the wall, at the work she had made, which was also the proof she had made, which was also the future she had made from what she had been given and what she had refused to surrender. She thought about her father who had crossed an ocean because he believed in something on the other side of sacrifice. She thought about what it meant to build something that would outlast you, not because you were finished, but because you had laid a foundation solid enough for others to build upon. "Talk to Astrid first," she said finally. "She noticed before I did." Leander was quiet. "Then she told me the same thing. Last week." The wall stood in the long evening light. Somewhere behind them, Wren moved through the new grass, following her nose through the growth with the absorbed pleasure of a creature who finds the world endlessly worth investigating. The laughter that came from Solveig surprised her. It was not polished laughter, not the careful kind that people produce when they want to appear lighthearted. It was the real thing, sudden and warm, the sound of someone who has been carrying something difficult for a very long time and has just discovered that the weight has shifted into something different. Not lighter, exactly, but differently distributed, shared. Some walls, she was beginning to understand, are not built from cordwood and mortar. They are built from trust, laid course by course over time, sealed with the small acts of showing up, bringing wood, without being asked, mixing mortar when the trough runs low, staying after the work is done, because the place and the person in it are reasons enough to stay. Wren died the following spring, on a morning that smelled of mud and new growth, and the particular mineral freshness that comes up from the earth when the frost has finally gone deep enough down to stop mattering. She had been slowing through the winter, not suffering, not diminishing in the ways that involve visible distress, but simply becoming quieter, requiring more rest, spending more time in her chosen position beside the stove. She ate when food was offered. She went outside when she needed to. She slept more than she had and woke more slowly, but when she woke, her eyes were still clear and her attention was still full, and she still pressed against a person when pressing was what was needed. She died in the cabin on her side near the stove, in the way that creatures die when the body has finished its work and lets go without a fight. Solveig found her in the early morning, in the ordinary quiet, before the day began. She sat with her for a long time before she did anything else. She sat the way she had sat with her father and then her mother in rooms far from this one present, and honest about what presence costs when it is all that remains to give. The stove ticked. The morning light came through the oiled paper windows in the way it always had. Everything in the cabin was exactly as it should be, except for the one thing that was not. Astrid carved her name on a flat piece of limestone from the creek bank, the same creek where they had found the stone for their mortar, where the limestone jutted from the embankment in long, flat shelves, as though the earth had been waiting for someone to notice. She carved it slowly because it deserved to be done well. Wren. Faithful to the end. They buried her under the cedar tree that Solveig had planted in the second autumn, which had grown considerably and now provided real shade on summer afternoons. The grave was at the base of the tree between two roots in the soft soil that the tree's presence had kept from compacting. Clara came to the burial. She was 8 now taller than she had been, with the particular self-possession of a child who has been through something real and has come out the other side still themselves. She set a small bunch of wildflowers, the first ones of the season, pale and slightly tentative, at the base of the limestone marker without ceremony. Then she stood for a long moment with her hands folded and did not say anything, because she was old enough to understand that some things do not need words. Then she looked at Solveig with the directness that children have when they have decided something deserves a direct question. She knew about the storm, Clara said. Before it came. She knew. Yes, Solveig said. She did. How? Solveig thought about the frequencies below human range, the mortar, the stone, the wood, the air, the 1,000 small signals that the earth broadcasts continuously to anything attentive enough to receive them. The earth gives you everything you need, she said. You only have to be willing to look. Clara considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Then, will you teach me what you know? All of it. Solveig looked at the child who had not spoken for 2 days in a storm, and had come back to language through the warmth of a dog's side, and had not since stopped asking questions. Yes, she said. Come on, Wednesday. We'll start with the limestone. The cabin stood. Seasons came and went around it, each one finding the walls unchanged, the mortar tight, the rounds solid, the sawdust fill doing its patient work of slowing the passage of heat in both directions. The cedar shakes on the roof needed replacing twice over the years, which was ordinary maintenance and not a failure. The door frame settled slightly and required adjustment, which Leander made on a Saturday morning with tools and attention and the quiet competence that had become one of the things Solveig most trusted in the world. The children who grew up in the territory grew up knowing what cordwood walls were, because there were many examples around them, and because the women who had built the first one were not shy about explaining what they had done and why. Astrie's documentation was copied and recopied until the original bark pieces became fragile with handling. She made a proper copy on paper when paper could be afforded, and that copy was copied in its turn by people who wanted to build in places where cordwood was the available material. The knowledge moved the way knowledge moves, when it is genuinely useful from hand to hand, from place to place, carried by people who had something to lose and understood what it was worth. It moved without ceremony. It moved without anyone declaring it important. It moved because people who needed to build shelter in places where good timber was scarce found that it worked, and working was recommendation enough. By the time a decade had passed, there were cordwood walls across a wide stretch of the territory. Not all of them were built by people who knew where the technique had come from. Not all of them knew the names of the sisters who had proved it could stand. But they were warm in winter and cool in summer, and they held their mortar and they shed their rain. And that was what mattered to the people who lived in them. Among those who carried the knowledge forward, Clara, who had grown into a young woman with her mother's steadiness and a curiosity entirely her own, who came to the cabin every Wednesday for years, as Solveig had promised, learning the limestone and the mortar and the end grain and the plumb line. Clara eventually built her own small school on the eastern edge of the settlement, and it was built from cordwood, and she taught in it for 30 years, and the walls were still standing long after she was gone, which was, she had always said, exactly the point. And Astri, who never married and never left, who continued to investigate and document and refine the techniques with the systematic patience of someone who understands that knowledge is never finished, only more understood. Her final document, written in a clear hand on proper paper, ran to 47 pages, and included calculations that the doctor found when he finally read it to be more rigorous than anything he had encountered in his formal training on the subject of heat transfer and material insulation. He said so in a letter he wrote to her, which she kept in the tin box, where she kept important things alongside the original bark pieces and the folded paper from their father's boot. The tin box eventually passed to Clara, who kept it on a shelf in her schoolroom, and the children who sat in that room grew up knowing that knowledge was a thing that traveled across oceans, across generations, through hard winters and harder mornings, and arrived eventually where it was needed. Years later, Solveig sat on the step of the cabin she and Astri had built, which was also the cabin she and Leander had raised their children in, which was also the cabin that had become the first of many things without trying to be the first of anything, and watched the long light of a summer evening cross the clearing. The clearing was different now than it had been. The stumps were mostly gone, removed over years of patient work, burned out or dug out or simply rotted down into the soil they had come from. In their place, a kitchen garden along the south wall, a woodshed to the east, a small barn beyond that. The scrub and brush that had choked the space between the original stumps had given way gradually to grass and clover, and the particular wildflowers that moved in when the soil had been disturbed and was beginning to recover. The cedar tree over Wren's grave was the tallest thing in the clearing, now shading the corner where the limestone marker sat, and every summer it dropped its small dry cones around the base of the marker as though leaving something. Her granddaughter was sitting beside her, a serious child with Astri's eyes and Leander's patience and something that was entirely her own. A way of asking questions that suggested she had already formed a hypothesis and was checking it against reality rather than against what she hoped to find. She had been asking questions since she learned to talk, and she had not slowed down. "Tell me about the winter," the child said, not for the first time. "Which part?" "The part where you were scared." Solveig looked at the walls of the cabin, at the mortar that had held through more winters than she had counted, precisely still tight, still true, the round ends of the cedar logs still bright where the evening sun caught them at this angle. The south wall was the one that got the most sun, and it was also the one that had held up best over the decades. Astri had explained why, back in the early years, something about the freeze-thaw cycle and the direction of moisture movement, and Solveig had listened and understood, and then promptly built a porch overhang to protect the north wall's mortar from the worst of the spring melt, which had helped. "Every single day," she said, "from the first morning to the last." "But you kept building?" "Yes." "Why?" Solveig thought about this, about the answer she had given in various forms over many years to different people in different circumstances, about what was underneath those answers, what remained when the easier explanations were set aside. The granddaughter was old enough for the real answer. She had always been old enough, probably. Because the building was the answer, she said finally. To the fear. To the people who said we couldn't. To the cold and the doubt and the mornings when the mathematics said, stop. She looked at her granddaughter. The building was the only answer I had, so I used it. Were you ever wrong about any of it? Solveig considered this with the same seriousness the child brought to her own questions. Yes, she said, several times. I was wrong about how long the lime needed to cure before we could build on it in cold weather. We lost 2 days of work in October, because I was wrong about that. I was wrong about how thick the chimney walls needed to be, and we had to rebuild part of it. I was wrong about... She paused. I was wrong about many things. The difference between being wrong and failing is whether you correct the mistake or let it stand. The child thought about this. The evening light moved across the clearing, doing what light does in the long evenings of summer, taking its time finding the surfaces worth finding, settling into the mortar joints of the cabin wall with the unhurried interest of something that has come a long way and intends to stay for a while. Will you teach me everything? Yes, Solveig said. Everything your great-grandfather carried across an ocean. Everything your great-aunt wrote down so none of it would be lost. Everything I learned on my own and everything I learned from people who knew more than I did about things I needed to understand. She looked at the walls one more time, the walls that stood where no walls should have been, that had held through the winter that everyone said would kill them, that had sheltered 17 people on the worst night anyone in that territory could remember. All of it. So it keeps moving forward. And if I make mistakes... Solveig looked at her granddaughter. At the serious face and the curious eyes and the hands that were already at this age always reaching for something to examine or build or take apart. Then you correct them, she said, and you keep building. The light held the clearing for one more moment. Then it moved the way light moves, the way time moves, the way knowledge moves from one pair of hands to the next, steadily without drama across the distance between what is and what will be. In the clearing, the cedar tree over Wren's grave caught the last of the light and held it a moment longer than everything else, the way certain things do the things that have earned the right to hold on a little longer. Then the light was gone from there too, and the evening settled into the particular blue that comes just before dark. And somewhere in the brush at the edge of the land, a bird called once, and was answered. The granddaughter stayed where she was, on the step beside her grandmother. She did not ask any more questions. She had learned was learning would always be learning that some moments do not need to be filled. That silence like mortar holds things together if you give it enough time to set. Inside the cabin, Astri's lamp was lit. The shape of her at the table was visible through the oiled paper window bent over some document or drawing, still working at an age when most people would have stopped because the work was not finished and because stopping was something she had never quite learned to do. The light from the lamp was warm and steady, and it leaked through the paper window and touched the mortar of the south wall, and the mortar held it the way it had always held warmth, slowly, patiently, without losing any of it. The walls held the warmth. They always had. That was what they were for.